So, the wonderful world of fungi. So, most of the time when we talk about fungus, the very first thing that people think about is that they are closely related to plants. And the reason why people think they're related to plants is because, why? They look like they're growing from the ground. But what's a major characteristic that tells you that they're not photosynthetic? They're not green. They're lacking chloroplast. So people tend to classify things based on the way they look. We call that morphology. We learned that at the beginning of this semester. And the reality is that fungi are not even closely related to plants. In fact, they're more closely related to animals than they are plants. Fungi can live in various habitats, and we'll discuss that. And they are classified by how they reproduce. So the different types of fungi will be broken apart by their methods of reproduction. And we'll talk, that's truly the characteristics that we will use to distinguish them. But overall, most people can tell you that fungus are used as decomposers. Many fungi are decomposers. They eat or consume dead or decaying matter. So, overall, they're really important in our carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is the circle of life. So they are a detrivore, may also be called a saprotroph or a decomposer. These are all terms that are used to describe different ways that fungi operate. All mean the same thing, just different words. Saprotroph, detrivore, and decomposer. Fungi can be single-celled or multicellular. The single-celled fungi that we're going to talk about will be yeast. And when it's single-celled, what does that mean that you have to use to view it? A microscope. When we say it's multicellular, that means it has many cells, but it's within one organism. This is different than being colonial, which is what we just spoke about in protist. So, real quick, colonial means you have a lot of unicellular organisms that all live together in a colony, but they are all individuals. When you have an organism that is multicellular, it is one organism that has many cells. So a colony has many cells, but they're all individual cells, individual living organisms, okay? Making sure to distinguish between those two. Fungi, of course, we just discussed, are not autotrophic. They are heterotrophic, and they obtain their nutrients by extracellular digestion. They don't have a stomach. They don't have a digestive tract, fanciness and all of that. And I kind of demonstrated that the other day, but once again, they kind of shoot out an acid, digestive enzymes, like stomach acid, if you will, and they digest the area around them, and then they absorb it. And then that causes them to get bigger, and then they can shoot out more, digest that area around them, and absorb it. Fungi they have a large surface area and are known for their power of absorption. They are really, really good at absorbing. All fungi reproduce by way of spores. That's going to be a term we see over and over for this chapter. So they all use spores, but the way they reproduce is different. Okay, again, that's how we're going to classify them. Again, the single cell is yeast, and that's what we are going to view today in the lab. By the time you get there, they were fed sucrose. So what is sucrose? Sugar. They were fed sugar, and guess what? I mean, it's pretty simple. It's easy for them to absorb, so they're going to like that. They're putting them in a happy environment, so they're going to reproduce pretty quickly. Yeast is what we use whenever we bake breads and such. We do the same thing. We add a sugar. It feeds the yeast. The yeast reproduce and release carbon dioxide, and it causes your food to rise, that bread to rise. Okay, so that's how it functions. Multicellular yeast, we're going to use the term mycelium. Mycelium. And real quick, I didn't mention this, but while I see this, I want to point it out. The study of fungus is called mycology. Mycology. So M-Y-C-O, mycology. In my simplistic mind, a mycelium is like one strand of wet spaghetti. like a spaghetti noodle. That's what it looks like. Fungi do not have like a formal structure body plan. They're made up of individual mycelium, and when you put a whole bunch of those mycelium together, they're made up of little segments called hyphae. They're going to be a group, and you'll see it. You'll see it. A mass of hyphae is what we call all of that together. Bless you. So I don't know. I can't recall if there's a good picture here. Yes, good. So here we have, you can see, this is what you and I are going to end up calling septate hyphae, which just means it has a segmentation. That's it, just a septa, a wall. But here's the individual strands, and they all come together to compose what we will call above ground. For a fungus, is called a fruiting body. If you can see it above ground, we call it a fruiting body. Most fungus is underground. It grows like this, and you'll see it having a symbiotic relationship with plant roots, but we'll get there at the end of this chapter. Yes?
So hyphae is a
group. It's backwards. I just saying that in my head. Hyphae is one. Mycelium is the group. So make sure, I'm positive I said that backwards. Hyphae is one spaghetti strand. Mycelium is all of it together. Hyphae is one, and we call these like septate. Again, I pointed that out, and we'll have non-septate or aseptate, which means that they don't have those walls. But hyphae is one. Mycelium is the group. It doesn't necessarily have to come together in a group like for this. We could say like this right here is a group of mycelium. So that's how you would say multiple hyphae would be mycelium. Thank you for saying that, because in my head, as soon as you asked that, I played it back what I said. So hyphae, and that's for multicellular. The only single cell that we're going to look at is yeast. Yes. Okay. What's that first word in blue? Chitin. Do you remember what biomolecule chitin is? It's a carbohydrate. It tells you that. It says polysaccharide. Poly means many, and then saccharide is sugar. So chitin is a carbohydrate. And when you learned carbohydrates, we talked about structural carbohydrates, and one of them was chitin. And I said you will find this in fungi and in the exoskeletons of arthropods, like the things that go crunch, bugs, lobster, all of that. So chitin is the carbohydrate found in fungus. Cellulose is found in plants. So a lot of times when you're looking at a test question and it says we found this organism and that has chitin in the cell wall, that indicates to you immediately you're dealing with fungus. It uses the word septa there. So septa is just a wall. It uses the term partition to describe it. So these are just walls that are present in some hyphae. And I showed you a moment ago. Just in some. There are some that do not have walls. Okay, so that gives them cell-like compartments. Not completely like individual cells, but cell-like compartments. There is the practice of cytoplasmic streaming. So cytoplasmic streaming is the cytoplasm moving from one part to the other to carry various things, nutrients, water, okay? Because we're going to talk about fungi and its ability to absorb. So like in plant cells, just for comparison purposes, plant cells have two distinct cells. Plant cells, and I'm using circles just because that's the easiest shape for my fingers. But what's in this cell can't just flow over to this cell because they have separate cell walls. But when we studied plant cells, we talked about this little pathway called the plasmodesmata. And it was a little pore that would allow like water and nutrients to kind of, because plant cells don't move themselves and water has to travel up. In fungi, we have these cellular setups kind of like this, where it kind of pinches, and that the nutrients flows through the so the cytoplasm itself is moving. So cytoplasmic streaming, like it's moving the nutrients. It's not going through a specific tiny little passageway because there's strong cell walls. It's kind of open there so that there's flow. That's just one of those, how things can flow through fungi. Extracellular digestion, and I already kind of discussed and demonstrated partially, because I'm not a fungus, but kind of what it would look like, how fungi eat. They kind of shoot out those digestive enzymes and break down the ground around them. So saprobes or saprotrophs, that means that they're eating stuff that's dead or decaying. Parasites, some fungi are parasitic, which means that that's a symbiotic relationship where they are benefited and the other one is harmed. Fantastic. And some fungi function as symbionts. And by symbionts here, this is a symbiotic relationship, but these are mutualistic symbionts. Mutualistic means that both partners in that partnership benefit. Mutualism is where both benefit. Parasitism is where one benefits and one is harmed. So fungi can play different roles in an ecosystem depending on the type of fungi. Reproduction. Asexual is pretty straightforward. It's a complete clone of that parent organism, and it takes place through the process of budding. And you're going to see that in lab today. You're going to see a yeast, and all it does is it kind of grows itself a little clone, and then it drops it off. Grows itself a little clone and drops it off. Of course, you're going to see it firsthand, but I will say that there was a SpongeBob episode that had him budding, like it was back in the day, and all of a sudden, because sponges also reproduce by budding, and he just started, baby sponges were just, and he was like, doing his SpongeBob crazy, annoying laugh, but he was budding. There are certain things, like when I watch annoying things, I'm like, that's actually correct. That's actually academically correct. That is how those sponges reproduce. You can watch this episode. But budding is a form of asexual, so those offspring are identical clones of that parent. Fragmentation is also an example of asexual reproduction. Fragmentation says that you just break a piece of it off, and from that piece, a new organism will grow. So a piece of it is broken off, and a new organism will grow. So we do this with plants. We do it with starfish. We can do it with some organisms that have the ability to regenerate. You just never really hear about it with fungi. So you just take a piece of that parent organism, and it will grow a new full organism. For sexual reproduction, the difference with sexual reproduction, of course, is that adds genetic variation. And so when we talk about sexual reproduction, we think of sperm and egg fusing and their recombination occurring and all that stuff. And that's just not exactly how it is for fungus. So that's truly how we classify them. We're going to classify them on their method of reproduction. So plasmogamy, well, it's on the next slide. It's defined, so I'll go to the next slide. Plasmogamy says, did I go too far? Yes. Plasmogamy says that you have two parent cells, and they come together, but the nuclei don't fuse, just the cytoplasm does. So the two parent cells come together, and the cytoplasm fuses, but it has two nuclei, so it becomes what we call a dikaryon. Di means two, and karyo means nucleus. But because it has both parents' nuclei, it's genetically different. Does that make sense? Than it was to either of the parents, because it has two. In karyogamy, those two cells come together and the nuclei fuse. So that's kind of what you and I are used to. In both situations, meiosis will generate haploid spores. In both situations, meiosis will generate haploid spores. When this comes together, because the nuclei fuse, it's diploid. Because you get a haploid and a haploid from a parent. Do you remember what haploid and diploid mean? throwback, like I just assumed, honestly, that you remembered that. Haploid means you have half of one parent, so one set of chromosomes. Do you remember how many sets of chromosomes you and I have? 2. We have 2. One from mom, one from dad, and they came together, so we have 2. So when you have haploid spores, it's like half that parent's genetic material, half of the other parent's genetic material, so half and half should come together and make 2. In plasmogamy, because the nuclei don't fuse, it never becomes a diploid. You just have 2 haploid nuclei because they didn't fuse. But in karyogamy, where they come together and fuse, then it becomes diploid. Okay? Either way, when either one goes to reproduce, they form haploid spores. Does anybody remember who we believe the precursor was for fungi? We said this in the last chapter. It was a protist. Do you remember which protist? Is the very last one. Is it an episticon? It's the very last one. The cyanoflagellate, or flagellate, yes. And they believe that those are the precursors to both fungi and animals. So, fungus were present on Earth around 500 million years ago, we assume, based on fossil records. What we see is that it slowly began to evolve. What caused the evolution of different fungi? The environment, fantastic. So we will have 7 groups that we're going to look at. So those are the 7 groups that you'll need to be familiar with. And although each of the characteristics for their reproductive methods are listed on this slide and the following one, we're going to go and discuss briefly each one in just a little bit more detail. So you have the chytrids, the zygomycetes, the glomerulomycetes, ascomycetes, basidiomycetes. Do you see the my in all of those? That tells you that. And then you get here to conidial. This is your yeast. And then microsporidia, which is parasitic. Here is, and that was the intro slide, so we're going to go into each in a little bit more detail. Here is that protist ancestor. And then we start to see the environment change. Time passes, of course, and we can tell that by the movement of this diagram. We have our different phyla that show up. So we have 7 major groups of fungi that we're going to discuss briefly. There is a chart in your textbook. I notice how I didn't say lab book. There is also one in your lab book, but there's one in your textbook, and there's one for each of these, for bacteria, for protists, and for fungi. Make sure you're referencing that to review for the test, okay? Because it kind of puts everything together for you and helps organize it. It may say a couple things. If you've been reviewing, hopefully you have, it may say a couple things that your review does not include. We're going to go through each of these on the next slides, but this is out of the text. First phyla, the Chytridiomycota, or the chytrids. So these are believed to be the first branch to develop, and that kind of makes sense because they're the only fungi that can move. And motile, do you recall what motile means? It can move in an aqueous type environment, a liquid environment. So it swims, versus mobile, which means terrestrial movement. Okay? So most fungi, even whenever they go to reproduce, the spores are just, they land where they're going to land, and they stay there. This is the only phyla that has spores that can swim, so they're flagellated, which means they have flagella. And this is a benefit because they can get away from the parent organism. Why do we want the offspring to get away from that organism? So that it doesn't have to compete. So it doesn't have to compete for resources. Okay, so we have flagellated spores. Chytrids are known for their infection to amphibians, and they can become parasitic to amphibians and kill them. So that's why these frogs are here. This frog is not a chytrid. It can carry that fungus. That's why it's here. Just to clarify that. I didn't want anybody being like, oh, it's not. No, that's an animal. Okay? Zygomycota. So it's pretty much one slide for each of the phyla. So Zygomycota or Zygomycetes, aseptate hyphae. So septate means it has that little cross wall. Aseptate, A just tells you it's lacking that. Okay? So it says that they're coincidic, which means that they may have many nuclei within their cytoplasm. So they don't necessarily have to be uninucleated or dinucleated. They could have many. As far as their reproductive method, which is what makes them what makes them unique from the others, they have sexual reproduction using positive and negative mating types. So positive and negative are at the ends of their hyphae, and the positive and negative will come together and form a new organism when those two meet. If not, this grows underground. You don't really see it growing above ground. It grows underground. And when at the tips of those hyphae just happen to meet and be positive and negative, then a fruiting body will come up from there. So that's what this is saying here. In the event that a fruiting body is formed, look at how that fruiting body releases spores from a stalked sporangium. Remember whenever I said this is a really cool protist because it shoots its babies off? I don't know if you remember I said that. Anyways, I did say that. That's what we're going to see a lot of in these fungi, is that they're going to grow this fruiting body above ground, and then when it's time for them to reproduce and spread their offspring, they shoot them off into the air. Notice that these aren't flagellated, so they don't swim. The only way to get the offspring away from the parent is to shoot it off and make it airborne. So you can kind of see, and these are actually really, really small. Like I realize that you can see them clearly, but this is highly magnified. But here, it's this parent stalk, and it's going to be shooting off its offspring. A lot of them, it's not like a catapult type thing. It's like they do this little plume of dust, and it just has all their little babies in it. And that because it's so light, when the wind blows, it just carries it away. Again, that's so that those offspring are not competing with the parent for resources. You're going to see that pattern over and over and over again. The glomerulomycota. So it says endomycorrhizae. First of all, I haven't taught you what mycorrhizae is. Mycorrhizae is a symbiotic relationship with plant roots, and we talk about it at the bottom, or not the bottom, at the end of this chapter. But endomycorrhizae means that this is a type of fungus that grows into the plant cell. So the hyphae will infiltrate the inside of the plant cell so it has access to the vacuole. Do you remember what the vacuole is supposed to have in it? Water. And you know what fungi are really good at conducting? Water. So it's a mutualistic relationship because the fungi can help absorb more water and provide more water to those cells. But it's called endomycorrhizae because it goes into the cell. The other form, which is not on this slide, but just so you know, is ectomycorrhizae. And the ectomycorrhizae stays outside of the cell walls. It doesn't actually go through it. Just so you know. Not here on this slide, but for your own reference. And remember how I mentioned just a moment ago that a lot of this fungus is completely underground and we don't really see it. That's definitely what we have here. It forms a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. Can you tell me why it would benefit if I had a plant root and it was wrapped in fungi? It would be really, really good at absorbing water, especially maybe in some arid regions where there maybe not be a lot of water. Maybe not be, it's not a thing. Where there may not be a lot of water all the time. But it's a symbiotic relationship, mutualistic. So if the fungus brings the plant water, what does the plant do for the fungus? When you say nutrients, what did you say? It does give it a place to grow, but remember they're benefiting each other. What does a plant do for a fungus? When you say energy, sugar. Where do plants make their food? In their leaves, and it travels which direction? Down, and it stores the excess sugar in its roots. So if I have a fungus who can't make its own food, right, it has to eat it, and normally decomposes things, but they decide to have a symbiotic relationship. If it was decomposing the plant, it would be bad. So instead, the plant feeds it sugar, the fungus grows, the fungus brings the plant water. And they're both very successful. No. So what I said, it went through that vacuole, so it's helping to absorb water and deliver it there. Yeah? Does that make sense? That's for endomycorrhizae, so it goes into. Ecto, again, is on the outside of it. But yes, ma'am. As far as reproduction, asexual reproduction in the spores, which are those haploid spores, form at the tips of the hyphae. And this is all going to be underground, so there's not going to be a shooting off of these. The Ascomycota, or Ascomycetes, are the sac fungi. And we have some of that in the lab where you can actually put your hands on it. So I always like that. It makes it easier for me to learn stuff when I can touch it and see that it's a real thing, not just a picture in the textbook. But what do you think sac fungi, knowing that fungi are classified based on what? Their way of reproduction. What do you think sac fungi use to reproduce? Sac fungi have haploid sexual spores. And you don't have to know the life cycle, but they are inside that sac used for reproduction. So sac, that's what they're used for. That's just their way of reproducing. And it shows you here, you have your haploid spores coming in. Karyogamy takes place. First is plasmogamy, then you don't have to know this again, but it's all inside that sac, and then the sac will shoot off the babies. Conidia, yeah, which is the term used for the asexual spores just in Ascomycetes. I think this is the only one that shows life cycle, but you don't have to know life cycle of fungi. For this test, just to clarify that, because that would be something I would be thinking of while I was studying. You have to know the name of the phyla, the characteristics of organisms within that phyla, and if there were any examples given. Does that make sense? And that's going from bacteria through fungi. What's your question? No, fungi doesn't only grow on plants. The last group that I said, the Glomerulomycota, that's just a one that has a mutualistic relationship with plants. Not all of them are like that. Some fungi are parasitic, like this one can be parasitic. Okay, so here is a Ascomycota, a type of fungi that has grabbed itself around a nematode at the very bottom of the ocean, and it is parasitic. It's going to kill it. So it's trapped it, and that's it. That's it for that little fella. Here's what you're going to be looking at underneath the microscope. It would be really cool if it's this clear, but you have just a single cell, and it's like budding, so you can see tiny little clones, shooting off. Basidiomycota. Basidiomycota are club-shaped, and that's the basidiospores. Basidio anything is that club shape, and that's how it's classified. So their basidia are their haploid spores, and they are developing on the basidiocarp. So Basidiomycota, basidiospores, basidia, all club-shaped. It's our club-shaped fungi. So that's the characteristics of it. Different examples of that. And one thing I want to point out on all of these, except for that one on the previous slide, none of them really have a green coloration to them. So it should be that many people can look at them and tell that they are not plants. But not everybody can. Anyway, Basidiomycota, so club-shaped.
They're all surface fungi?
On the surface. Like they can originate underground, but they can, what's it called whenever it grows up? The fruiting body is the part that comes out, but like it can hang out underground, then when it goes to reproduce, or it can be underground and it can, what's it called when you sprout? It's not sprouting, it's not a plant. Like, I want to say harvest, but that's the wrong word. Harvest is the ugly word for that. What is it called? Emerge? No.
Surface.
What is it called when you use something? It's going to come to me in like 5 minutes. But it's where it's like it shows up there. It, like you can see here, shelf fungi, they grow out like that. Like have you, in nature, if you're out in nature, you can literally see shelf fungi developing. So these fungi can grow underground, but they can manifest, is the word I'm looking for. Manifest. They can manifest above ground and live above ground. These shelf fungi, we have a relationship with that tree. Shelf fungi you usually see growing on trees. You have the same thing that we saw with that endomycorrhizae, where one's providing water and nutrient absorption, and the other one is providing food for that. So your question was, are they all under? You asked if these were all above ground, and I was saying that they can be underground and they can manifest above ground. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Oh, I thought you said no. Okay, Conidial fungi, which is our imperfect fungi. This is our yeasts. Okay? As far as sexual phases, there's not been any observed. We know that it buds, so that's a form of asexual reproduction. When we talk about its shape, we say it's anamorphic. So morph is like a form, body form, shape. The lack of that. So anamorphic means that it doesn't really have a specific form or shape. Let's see. Oh, I thought it was about to show us yeast, sorry. So that's our yeast, the imperfect. The last is our associations, fungal associations. So there are two fungal associations we're going to discuss, lichens and mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae has already been brought up, and that's that relationship with the roots. But then there's lichens. And lichens actually came up in our last chapter, protist, because there's a component of lichens that includes protist, like algae. So if I'm an algae and I'm a fungus, what is it that algae need? Water. And what are fungi really good at absorbing? Water. And what is it that fungi need that algae could provide? Sugar. So we have that type of association. And then the crispiness, that of course that's dehydrated, but the protist, the algae, is feeding that fungus, and that's what forms that lichen. It is lichen that we know has created the first soils, and I had talked about that with primary and secondary succession in our last lecture. So does it necessarily have to be algae as its photosynthetic partner? No, but a lot of times it is, like a cyanobacteria, could be that. Anything that's photosynthetic that could produce sugars or food that it could eat, because again, fungi are heterotrophic. And then mycorrhizae are the fungal associations with roots, and we're going to talk about each just a little bit more detail. Yes, well here. So lichens are symbiosis or symbiotic relationships between a fungus and some photosynthetic counterparts. It can be algae, cyanobacteria. Those are both photosynthetic, and it could be different types of fungi. It doesn't have to be a specific phyla of fungi. Proceed.
So lichens aren't actually their own thing. They're two different
Oh.
together? Lichens are like a type of fungus? Not a type, but like that's what we call them.
Lichen is a combination of two things, by definition. It does have a photosynthetic aspect, and it does have a fungal aspect. So it's two totally different things coming together. We talked about a lot of times you can see them on the sides of trees, and it's usually on the side facing water. So I said, like when you do your naked and afraid stuff and you're stranded, if you see lichen, you know there's water somewhere near, because that's an indication of that. And it also, depending on the side of the tree that it grows on or the side of the rock that you find it on, that it's in that direction. So you can use that. Now you don't need a compass anymore. You're like, oh, I found lichen. Water's this way. The structure of lichen, although for you and I, and when you look at it in lab, it just kind of flakes off. A lot of people who don't know think it's part of the bark or think it's an infection, the tree has an infection. It actually has a full body plan. So let's just hypothesize, I'm sure you're writing this down, but it still doesn't tell you exactly what I'm trying to. So we have a fungus, and we have some photosynthetic counterpart. Let's say it's cyanobacteria. Fungus and cyanobacteria. Which one do I want towards the surface? Fungus or cyanobacteria? Why do I want cyano on top? Access to the sun. The fungus that's absorbing the water, I don't want it to have direct access to the light because it'll do what? Dry out. So when we just talked about that logically, it's crazy because we can say that logically, and that's truly what their body plan looks like for a lichen. Let me show you real quick. Of course, this is the academic way of saying what we've already said. Let me say that before I click this. Algal cells, so this is using algae instead of a cyanobacteria, supply the carbohydrates. What carbohydrate am I talking about? Sugars. And those are supplied for the fungus. And the fungus supplies water for that organism. Here's the body plan. So here's whatever it's attached to. And then here are all the hyphae, or that group mycelium, together to absorb the water. And then look, I have my green at the top, my green flakes at the top. And of course, I want the photosynthetic organism, to have access to that sun so that it, of course, can create those carbohydrates and feed that fungus. When we see different color and not green, what does that indicate to us? If we see green, what do we know is there? Chloroplast. What pigment? Yeah, chlorophyll. Do you remember back in the day there was a different color than chlorophyll? Xanthophyll, carotene, yes, all of those other pigments. So it doesn't necessarily have to be green, although obviously it is. So I just wanted to point that out, especially looking at those other colors of lichen there. Video on lichen. Yes. Moss is bryophytes. So the answer is yes. And we'll study bryophytes when we get to plants. But moss are the first non-vascular plants. And they formed from protists, specifically algae, and that's our first form of plant. So they are our segue into full plants. So moss and lichen are different. Yes, ma'am. So they do. Are you talking about, do they have an association with fungus? Moss? Is that what you mean by water?
No, I just remember I was watching something and they said moss can grow on a rock or something to show where the water is too.
Yes, they do. They do. Moss need water to reproduce. So you will only find moss near water because their babies have flagella, which is from their protist ancestor. Does that make sense? And so they have to be near water, and mosses can only grow to be a millimeter or two high. So they're super tiny and they rely on water, but they only need a drop of water to reproduce, like one drop. They don't need like running water. But yes, ma'am. So you will see them near water because they have to be there. They have to have water to have babies. Yes. This is what I was talking about the other, I mentioned that you can tell where water is, but we can also use lichen to gather information on the ecosystem. So if we're an ecologist and we're going into a new ecosystem to try to gather data about this habitat and about food resources and so on, what's in this area, we can use lichen. Lichen will draw up water, so if there's any type of toxin or pollutants in the water, it's there. And the photosynthetic counterpart is pulling from the air, the atmosphere, carbon dioxide and any other pollutants that might be there. So this is a prime organism to sample the overall environment, water and atmospheric toxins if they're present. So lichen are just really, they're really cool, I guess. Kind of creepy looking, but really cool. Mycorrhizae are the ones that live within the roots of plants. Okay, and here it explains their fungal and photosynthetic relationship using academic terms. The plant roots provide carbohydrates, amino acids, and growth-enhancing substances to the fungus. So they feed the fungus, and the fungus bring it water and any like minerals or whatever it can pull by absorption. Okay, so mutualistic relationship. They're both benefiting. And this is just a story, not a story, but a case study out of your text when they were talking about how a fungus, Texas A&M did research on how fungus infects plants. So that's a focus story in your text. What questions do you have about fungus, about life, because it's biology, protists, bacteria, anything in your head? Yes. Which one came first, moss or lichen? Oh, I thought you were about to answer it. That's an excellent question. Which one came first, moss or lichen?
Because when we learn about like succession, they're like, oh, moss and lichen.
Yes.
Because didn't you say moss came from
Protists, but so did fungi. And some aspect of lichen can be cyanobacteria. That is an awesome question. That's an awesome question. Lichen. Lichen is a soil producer. So lichen will actually erode and break down rock. So when you talk about primary and secondary succession, one of the very first things that come in after lava, after rock, after complete barrenness is lichen. And there has to be access to water for there to be moss. Your question. Good question. That was really good.
You said moss was the first non-vascular
Plant.
But I thought it had to be...
It's a bryophyte. It doesn't necessarily have to be moss. Go ahead.
I thought it had to have vascular tissue.
Great question. So when we talk about the evolution of plants, we're going to have groupings of plants. We'll have non-vascular, seedless vascular plants like you'll see them. So these technically are a plant because they're multicellular, but they're only a few millimeters tall because they require the water to stand up and to reproduce. So bryophytes are a very first, but we see them on the surface only, version of land plants. Great question. Yes. Love that thought process. You big nerds. I love it. Love it. Other questions? Okay, because we have a minute.